Welcome to Crossdressing Stories. Here, we share personal stories, celebrate self-expression. If you're on your own journey or simply curious, you've found your community. Subscribe and join the conversation.
Aria was not born in a hospital, but in a dusty photography studio under the warm, affirming glow of a camera flash. The resignation of Arthur Worthington was the death of a ghost, and with every step Aria took into her new life, she felt more solid, more real. The journey, however, had just begun, and she was about to discover that while she had shed the skin of her father's son, she could not so easily escape his shadow. A shadow that would stretch across the globe to snuff out her nascent light before it ever had a chance to truly shine. The first few months were a whirlwind of creation and cautious hope. Aria and Lily were an inseparable team, a two-woman force fueled by coffee, shared dreams, and the unshakable belief that they were on the right path. They transformed the studio above the gallery into their command center. The photos Lily had taken were just the beginning. They meticulously built a professional portfolio, collaborating with aspiring makeup artists and stylists who were drawn to Aria's unique, ethereal beauty and her quiet, powerful presence. Aria was learning to live in the world as herself, a process that was both liberating and daunting. There was the joy of choosing her own name, of buying clothes that felt like a second skin, of the simple, profound rightness of seeing her own reflection and finally recognizing the person staring back. But there was also the fear, the sideways glances from strangers, the constant, low-level anxiety of navigating a world not always built for her. Lily was her anchor through it all, her fierce, unwavering acceptance a shield against the world's harsh edges. With a stunning portfolio in hand, they decided to aim high. They targeted Elysian Models, a boutique agency renowned for championing unconventional beauty and launching the careers of some of the industry's most iconic faces. After weeks of persistent emails, they secured a meeting. The agency's office was a minimalist expanse of white walls and polished concrete. The agent, a formidable woman named Corinne with sharp eyes and an even sharper haircut, flipped through Aria's portfolio with an unnerving, silent intensity. Aria sat with her hands clasped, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. Finally, Corinne looked up, her severe expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Your look is arresting," she said, the word hanging in the air. "There's a story in your eyes. A certain melancholy, but also a strength. The camera loves you." A spark of pure, unadulterated hope ignited in Aria's chest. This was it. This was the moment. "I'm very intrigued," Corinne continued, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on Aria's headshot. "Leave the book with me. I'll make some calls. I'll be in touch by the end of the week." Aria and Lily left the office floating on air, the city streets below feeling like a dreamscape. For 3 days, every ring of the phone sent a jolt of adrenaline through Aria. But the end of the week came and went in silence. When Lily finally called the agency, Corinne's assistant was curt. "Ms. Vasseur has reviewed the portfolio and decided not to move forward at this time." The rejection was a cold, hard slap. It was more than just a no, it was the inexplicable reversal, the slam of a door that had seemed, for one hopeful moment, to be opening. They tried another agency, and then a third. The pattern became a haunting refrain: initial, palpable excitement from agents, followed by a sudden, chilling silence and a polite, impenetrable wall of rejection. Aria's hope began to fray, replaced by a creeping, familiar dread. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it. A powerful, invisible hand was working against her, ensuring that every door she approached was locked before she could even touch the handle. The rejections mounted, each one a small, sharp paper cut on Aria's already fragile confidence. The initial excitement from agents, once a source of hope, became a form of psychological torture. She would see the spark of interest in their eyes, the genuine admiration as they studied her portfolio, only to be met with that same, inevitable wall of silence days later. The polite, vague emails all started to sound the same. "Not the right fit for our board right now, an incredibly competitive season. We wish you the best of luck elsewhere." The optimistic energy that had filled Lily's studio began to dissipate, replaced by a heavy, unspoken frustration. Aria grew quieter, more withdrawn. The vibrant woman who had emerged in the mirror was starting to flicker, threatened by the cold wind of a world that seemed determined to refuse her. The old, insidious voice of her father began to whisper in the back of her mind. Unnatural. A disappointment. You are not worthy of the Worthington name. Was he right? Was this entire endeavor a foolish, childish fantasy? The doubt was a bitter poison, seeping into the cracks of her resolve. Lily, however, was not one to accept defeat or unexplained phenomena. She was a creator, a problem solver. She knew patterns, and the pattern here wasn't random. It was deliberate. It felt like a coordinated, silent campaign. This isn't about your look, Aria, she insisted one evening, pacing the studio floor. This is about something else. Someone is pulling strings. Her suspicion gnawed at her until she decided to act. She remembered a young, ambitious makeup artist named Chloe she had collaborated with on one of Aria's test shoots. Chloe had just landed a coveted assistant position at Elysian Models, the first agency that had shown such strong interest. On a hunch, Lily invited her for coffee, far from the agency's polished offices. At first, Chloe was bubbly, talking about the industry's glamour. But when Lily gently steered the conversation toward Aria's portfolio and Corinne's sudden reversal, a shudder came down over Chloe's face. She became evasive, stirring her latte with nervous energy. Please, Chloe, Lily pressed, her voice low. I'm not trying to get you in trouble. But this is destroying my friend. One minute Corinne is about to sign her, the next she won't even take our call. What happened in those 3 days? Chloe glanced around the cafe, her expression fearful. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. You can't tell anyone you heard this from me. I could lose my job. Everything. Lily nodded, her heart beginning to pound. The day after you came in, Chloe whispered, Corinne was on a call with legal and finance. Then she had a closed-door meeting. I heard the name. Worthington. Arthur Worthington. Chloe looked Lily directly in the eye. Your friend. Is she related to the Arthur Worthington? The name landed like a punch to the gut. She's his daughter, Lily said, the words feeling like a confession. Chloe's face was a mixture of pity and terror. That's it, then, she breathed. The word came down from the top. Not just to us, but to everyone. Arthur Worthington Sr. let it be known, through his lawyers and his corporate partners, that any agency, brand, or publication that works with his child will find themselves facing a sudden and severe withdrawal of all Worthington-affiliated business. Advertising, sponsorships, investments, everything. He's not just closing doors, Lily. He's building a wall around her and cementing it shut. Lily sat back, the coffee cup cold in her hands. The invisible hand now had a name. It was the hand that was supposed to have guided and protected, now being used as a weapon of annihilation. When she told Aria later that day, the news didn't cause an outburst. It caused a terrifying, profound silence. Aria simply stood by the studio window, looking out at the city, her face pale and still. It was worse than she could have ever imagined. Her father hadn't just disowned her, he was actively trying to erase her. He was using the full, crushing weight of his empire not just to deny her dream, but to obliterate the very possibility of her existence in the world she so desperately wanted to join. The gilded cage had been dismantled, only to be replaced by an invisible, global prison. The initial shock of the revelation curdled into a heavy, suffocating despair. The world didn't just lose its color, it became an oppressive, gray fog. For days, Aria moved through Lily's apartment like a phantom, the vibrant energy that had defined her first weeks of freedom completely extinguished. She would sit for hours, staring at nothing, the portfolio, their beautiful, hopeful book of dreams, lying closed on the coffee table, too painful to open. Each page now felt like a taunt, a photograph of a future that had been murdered before it could be born. The name Worthington, which had once represented a gilded cage, now felt like a brand seared into her very soul, an inescapable mark that identified her as a target for her own father's wrath. He hadn't just used his influence, He had weaponized their shared history, turning his power, his name, his very legacy into a precision-guided missile aimed directly at her heart. This wasn't business, it was a deeply personal act of annihilation. He wasn't just rejecting her dream, he was rejecting her existence. Lily tried to rally, her practical, creative mind immediately shifting to countermeasures. "So, we go a different route," she argued, pacing the studio floor, her energy a stark contrast to Aria's stillness. "We go independent. We build your brand online. We go to Paris or Milan, somewhere his corporate reach isn't as absolute. We can fight this, Aria." "You don't understand," Aria finally said, her voice hollow, devoid of life. "His reach is everywhere. Worthington Industries has holdings, partnerships, investments in everything. European fashion houses, media conglomerates, shipping lines. It's not a wall, Lily, it's a mountain range. And he owns it." She finally opened the portfolio, her fingers tracing the outline of her own face in a photograph. In the picture, her eyes were full of a fierce, nascent hope. Now, they just looked naive. "This isn't a business decision for him," she whispered, the terrible truth of it settling in her bones. "He's not trying to stop me from being a model. He's trying to stop me from being. He wants to prove that Aria can't survive in the real world. That she has to die so Arthur Jr. can come back and crawl into his cage." "Don't you dare say that," Lily said, her voice sharp with fear and love. "He doesn't have that power." Aria looked up, and for the first time, Lily saw a terrifying glimmer of defeat in her eyes, a complete surrender. "He does," Aria said, a bitter finality in her tone. "He has all the power. I have nothing. I'm just a fantasy I let myself believe in for a little while." Her shoulders slumped. "It's over, Lily. He wins. Maybe it's time to give up. Maybe Aria was just a mistake." The words hung in the air, more devastating than any rejection letter. It was the sound of a soul preparing to extinguish its own light, to retreat back into the familiar, suffocating darkness of the prison she had only just escaped. "Don't you say that," Lily repeated, her voice fierce, grabbing Aria's arm. "Don't you let him win. Not after everything." But her words were like rain against a hurricane. Aria pulled away gently, her eyes hollow. "I need to be alone," she whispered, and retreated to the small guest room she'd been using, closing the door with a soft, final click. It felt like the door to a tomb. She curled up on the bed, the gray light of the city filtering through the blinds, and let the crushing weight of her father's victory wash over her. He had done it. He had proven that his world, the world of power and stone, had no place for someone like her. The garden of her soul, which had just begun to bloom, was being salted and burned. Hours passed. She was adrift in a sea of silent despair, drowning in the echoes of his past disapproval. In her mind, she was a small boy again, being dragged from the attic, the beautiful velvet dress torn, her father's face a mask of cold fury. This was just a slower, more deliberate version of that same violation. Her gaze fell upon her travel bag, left half unpacked in the corner. Inside, tucked away in a side pocket, was one of the very few things she had kept from her childhood home. It wasn't valuable or grand. It was a small, worn book of poetry by Mary Oliver, its cover soft with age. It had been her mother's. She remembered Eleanor reading from it in the garden, her voice a soft melody against the buzz of the bees. It was the only piece of her mother's gentle world she had managed to carry with her. She retrieved the book, its familiar weight a small comfort in her hands. As she opened the cover, a specific memory, sharp and vivid, rose unbidden from the depths of her mind. She was 7 years old, sitting on the lawn with her mother, not playing with the expensive toy soldiers her father had bought her, but carefully arranging fallen rose petals into intricate patterns on a flat stone. Her father had walked out onto the patio, his face disapproving. "He needs to be playing with boys," Arthur Sr. had said to his wife over Artie's head. "Toughen him up. All this softness, it's not right." Aria remembered the shame, the feeling of being wrong, of being a disappointment. But then she remembered her mother's response. Eleanor had looked up at her husband, her gaze clear and unwavering. His soul is not a fortress to be built, Arthur, she had said, her voice quiet but unyielding. It's a garden. You can't be angry with a rose for not being a stone. Then she had turned back to Artie, placing her warm hand over his. Never let anyone, she had whispered, her eyes full of a fierce, protective love, convince you that your softness is a weakness. It is your great strength. It allows you to see the beauty they are blind to. Your only job on this earth, my love, is to be exactly who you are. That is the bravest thing you can ever be. The memory, the words, struck Aria with the force of a lightning bolt. For 20 years, her father's voice had been the roaring hurricane in her head. But her mother's voice was the deep, unshakable earth beneath it all. He saw her softness as a flaw to be eradicated. Her mother had seen it as a strength to be celebrated. He demanded she become a stone fortress. Her mother had given her permission to be a flower in the garden. Aria sat up, clutching the book to her chest. The tears that came now were not tears of despair, but of grief and love and a dawning, ferocious resolve. Her father was not winning because he was powerful. He was trying to destroy her because he was blind. He was the one who was weak, incapable of understanding a beauty he could not own or quantify. This fight was no longer just about a career. It was no longer about walking a runway or seeing her face in a magazine. It was about her mother. It was about the little boy arranging rose petals on a stone. It was about honoring the one person who had seen his soul and called it beautiful. She would not let her father turn her mother's garden into a wasteland. She would not let him crush the rose. She stood up, wiped her eyes, and walked out of the room. Lily looked up from the sofa, her face etched with worry. She saw the change in Aria's eyes immediately. The hollow emptiness was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet fire. "You're right," Aria said, her voice steady and clear. "We fight." The decision to fight was one thing, the strategy was another. They were facing an enemy with near-infinite resources and an iron grip on the traditional gateways to the industry. They couldn't knock on the front door, because Arthur Worthington Sr. owned the door, the building, and the entire street. So, Lily said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of a new creative challenge. "We don't use his street. We build our own." The studio, which had been a place of despair, was transformed once more into a command center, but this time, it was a war room. They bought a whiteboard and filled it with a web of ideas, strategies, and potential pathways. If the established agencies were a no-go, they would bypass them. If mainstream fashion magazines were off-limits, they would ignore them. Their battlefield would be the one place her father's old world, top-down power structure was weakest, the chaotic, democratic, and unpredictable world of the internet. Their new mantra became create and release. They couldn't wait for a client to hire them, they would create the work themselves. Their audience wouldn't be a handful of powerful agents, but millions of ordinary people scrolling through their phones. The work was grueling but exhilarating. Lily's artistry and Aria's innate grace formed a powerful alchemy. Every day was a new shoot, a new concept. They didn't have a budget, so they used their ingenuity. They shot in the pre-dawn light on empty subway platforms, creating a stark, urban narrative. They staged elaborate, ethereal scenes in the middle of a public park, using colored smoke bombs and borrowed vintage clothing. Lily's textile art became a signature element. She wove intricate backdrops and even fashioned avant-garde garments directly onto Aria. Aria, freed from the pressure of pleasing a client, began to truly blossom in front of the camera. She wasn't just modeling clothes, she was telling a story, the story of her own becoming. Her posts were more than just images, they were visual poems. She wrote captions that were raw and vulnerable, speaking of identity, of beauty and imperfection, and of the courage to be oneself. She never mentioned her father or her famous last name. She was simply Aria, a girl with a story in her eyes. They were a tiny, two-woman production house, and it was exhausting. They learned about social media algorithms, about peak engagement times, about hashtags and collaborations. They were met with the vast, crushing indifference of the internet. Their first posts garnered a few dozen likes, mostly from friends. It was disheartening, but they were fueled by a new, unshakable purpose. Each photograph released into the world felt like a small act of defiance, a single flower pushing its way through a crack in her father's concrete wall. Slowly, painstakingly, something began to shift. A popular, independent fashion blogger stumbled upon one of their images, Aria, draped in a cascade of crimson silk against the stark gray of an industrial rooftop. The blogger reposted it, and suddenly, the likes turned from dozens to thousands. Her follower count began to climb, first by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Comments flooded in from all over the world. They were not just about her beauty, but about her perceived vulnerability and strength. "Your eyes make me feel less alone," one user wrote. "There is so much courage in these photos," wrote another. Aria was no longer just a model, she was becoming a symbol. She was a quiet, elegant revolutionary. People didn't know the specifics of her story, but they responded to the raw, unspoken truth in her images. In a world of manufactured perfection, her authentic, hard-won self-possession was a revelation. She was building her own runway, one pixel, one post, one follower at a time, and it was leading somewhere her father could never have anticipated. The slow, steady climb in her online presence became an obsession, a daily measure of their progress against an invisible enemy. Aria and Lily would analyze engagement, celebrate every milestone, and pour every ounce of their energy into the next concept, the next shoot. The digital runway they were building was becoming a tangible place, a community. Aria began engaging with her followers, replying to comments and direct messages. She learned that the story in her eyes, which Corinne had first identified, was resonating with thousands of people who felt unseen, who were fighting their own private battles for acceptance. Her vulnerability became her superpower. The tipping point came from an unexpected direction. A highly respected, slightly rebellious photographer in London named Julian Vance, known for his raw, verite style and his disdain for corporate fashion, saw her work. He wasn't on Instagram, but his young assistant was, and she showed him Aria's profile. He was captivated not just by her look, but by the narrative quality of her self-produced images. He saw a collaborator, an artist, not just a model. He sent a direct message, a simple, stunningly direct sentence: "I'm shooting the winter campaign for a small, independent Parisian designer next week. I want you." The message felt like a detonation. It wasn't just a job, it was a validation from a true artist, an invitation to a world they had been trying to build for themselves. Paris. The word itself was a dream. But as the initial euphoria wore off, a cold dread set in. "His reach is in Paris," Aria said, the old fear resurfacing. "The designer will pull out. His lawyers will find a way." "Maybe," Lily conceded, her face set with determination. "But Julian Vance is a renegade. He doesn't play by the big corporate rules. And the designer, Maison Leandre, is new avant-garde. They might be disconnected enough, brave enough." The plane ticket, paid for with the last of their savings, felt like the biggest gamble of their lives. They flew to Paris with a single suitcase and a universe of hope and anxiety. The shoot was in a crumbling, beautiful old atelier, filled with dusty light and the ghosts of 100 years of art. Maison Leandre turned out to be a young, fiercely independent designer named Sébastien Leandre, who greeted Aria with a reverence that took her breath away. Julian Vance was exactly as he seemed online, intense, focused, and allergic to artifice. "I don't want you to model the clothes," he told her, his camera already in his hands. "I want you to inhabit them. Tell me your story with them." For 2 days, she did just that. She poured every ounce of her hard-won self, her pain, her resilience, her quiet joy, into every frame. The result was magic. When the campaign, titled "Lame Silence Use, the Silent Soul," was released online a month later, it didn't just make a splash, it created a tidal wave. The images were hauntingly beautiful, a perfect marriage of Leandre's sculptural designs, Vance's raw photography, and Aria's profound emotional depth. The whispers that had been building around her online presence erupted into a roar. The mainstream fashion press, which had been rendered deaf and blind by her father's influence, could no longer ignore her. They couldn't book her, but they could write about her. Who was this mysterious Aria? This model who had come from nowhere to become the face of the most talked-about independent campaign of the season? Her name was suddenly on the lips of editors, stylists, and designers across the globe. Her father had built a wall around the established industry. But Aria, with Lily's help, hadn't tried to scale it or smash it. She had simply flown over it, creating a new and compelling world on the other side. He had silenced the gatekeepers, but he couldn't silence the people. The roar was getting too loud to ignore. The Lame Silence U's campaign became a phenomenon. It was dissected on fashion blogs, celebrated by art school students, and shared endlessly across social media. Aria's face, with its captivating blend of melancholy and strength, was suddenly everywhere. She became the embodiment of a new kind of beauty, one that was authentic, soulful, and forged in a quiet, unseen fire. The industry was in a peculiar bind. The most talked-about new face in the world was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. She had no agency, no official representation. She was a public sensation who remained commercially untouchable. In his penthouse office overlooking the city, Arthur Worthington Sr. saw the campaign. An assistant, thinking he was being helpful, had placed a printout of an article from an influential online journal on his desk. The headline read, "The Soul of a New Generation. Who is Aria?" Beneath it was the lead image from the campaign, his child, looking regal and serene, a stranger wearing his wife's size. A cold, volcanic rage built in his chest. This was not supposed to happen. His blockade, his absolute assertion of power, was meant to crush this rebellion, to starve it of oxygen until it collapsed and the prodigal son came crawling back. But somehow, she had bypassed his walls entirely. She had created her own oxygen. He saw her poise, her beauty, and most infuriatingly, her undeniable success, and he did not feel an ounce of pride. He felt only the sting of ultimate defiance. He picked up the phone and dialed his head of legal. "I thought we made the company's position clear to our partners," he said, his voice dangerously low. "It appears we need to be more persuasive." The threats intensified. Lawyers made quiet but menacing calls to the parent companies of magazines that had dared to mention Aria's name. Brands that had liked her posts on social media received unsubtle reminders of their advertising budgets with Worthington Industries. The wall was being reinforced with steel and fear. But the roar was now too loud. In Milan, a living legend of the industry, Madame Isabella Dubois, was preparing her final haute couture show before retirement. A designer of uncompromising vision and unimpeachable reputation, she had ruled her eponymous fashion house for 50 years with an artist's soul and a will of iron. She was one of the few figures in the industry who had nothing left to prove and no one left to fear. She saw the Lame Silence U's campaign and was profoundly moved. She saw not a scandal, but a muse. She saw the future of beauty, a story that needed to be told on the grandest stage. She instructed her casting director to book Aria for the show's most important look, the final piece, the bridal gown. The casting director returned, pale-faced. "Madame Dubois, we cannot. The agencies will not represent her. There are significant political pressures from the Worthington Group." Madame Dubois, a tiny woman with an immense presence, fixed him with a stare that had withered far stronger men. "Worthington sells financial derivatives," she said, her voice cutting like glass. "I sell dreams. We're not in the same business. Find the photographer, Julian Vance. Go through him. Offer her whatever it takes. I will have that girl in my show. I will not have my final collection, my final statement, be dictated by a bully in a boardroom." The offer reached Aria through a breathless phone call from Julian. It was the call she had dreamed of her entire life. To walk for Dubois. To close the show. It was the very pinnacle of the modeling world, a validation so profound it was almost unimaginable. But as the glorious reality of the offer sank in, so did the terrifying implications. This was not an indie campaign that could fly under the radar. This was a direct, public challenge to her father on one of the most visible stages in the world. Accepting this was an act of war. "He'll be there," Aria whispered to Lily, her voice trembling. "Or if he isn't, his power will be. What if he tries to stop the show? What if he ruins it for her?" He can't, Lily said, grabbing her hands, her own eyes shining with a fierce, protective light. Du Bois is a legend. She's bigger than him in that world. This is it, Aria. This is the moment. This is the door he can't close. Aria looked at her own reflection in the studio window. She saw the fear in her eyes, but beneath it, she saw the quiet strength of the woman she had fought so hard to become. She remembered her mother's words, "Your only job on this earth, my love, is to be exactly who you are." That is the bravest thing you can ever be. Okay, Aria said, her voice quiet but firm, a decision settling in her soul. Tell them yes. Milan was a different world. The backstage area of the Du Bois Haute Couture show was a contained, chaotic universe of impossible beauty and raw, frantic energy. Racks of priceless, handcrafted garments stood like silent sculptures amidst a whirlwind of models, dressers, makeup artists, and photographers. The air was thick with the scent of hairspray and the murmur of a dozen languages. For Aria, who had built her career in the quiet intimacy of Lily's studio, it was an overwhelming sensory assault. She felt like an imposter, a girl playing dress-up who had accidentally wandered onto Olympus. The other models, seasoned professionals with an air of bored, effortless glamour, moved with a confidence she couldn't imagine possessing. She and Lily found their designated station, a small patch of relative calm in the storm. As a makeup artist began to work on her face, Aria's anxiety mounted. This was real. The weight of Madame Du Bois' final show, the eyes of the entire fashion world, the impending, unspoken confrontation with her father's power, it was all coalescing into this single, terrifying moment. It was then that she was approached by a man who was jarringly out of place. He wore an immaculately tailored, brutally expensive gray suit, his polished shoes silent on the concrete floor. He was not part of the creative chaos, he was a surgical instrument of the corporate world. "Miss Aria," he said, the hesitation on her name a deliberate, small cruelty. "I am Marcus Thorne. I represent your father's interests." The makeup artist's brush stilled. Lily immediately stepped forward, placing herself between them. "She's busy," Lily said, her voice cold. Thorne's gaze flickered to Lily with dismissive contempt before settling back on Aria. "My message is for her. Your father is aware of your participation in this spectacle. He wishes to extend a final offer. Cease this embarrassment now. Walk away. A position at the Worthington Foundation in Geneva has been arranged for you. A quiet, respectable life. The alternative," he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, "is that he will dedicate the full and considerable resources at his disposal to ensuring that this is not only your first and last show, but that the name you have chosen for yourself becomes synonymous with failure and scandal. He will not be defied." The threat was so direct, so cold, it sucked the air from her lungs. It was the voice of her father, filtered through his corporate machinery. It was an offer of the gilded cage, polished and presented as a mercy. Before Aria could even process the venom, another voice cut through the air, sharp and clear as a diamond. "And you, sir, are trespassing in my temple." Madame Isabella Du Bois stood there, a tiny, formidable icon in black. Her eyes, magnified by her signature large spectacles, were fixed on Thorne with fiery contempt. "You will leave this space immediately. My runway is a place for art and courage, not for the clumsy threats of insecure, powerful men. Tell Mr. Worthington that I am not one of his shell corporations to be bullied. Now get out." Thorne, for the first time, looked flustered. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod and vanished back into the chaos as quickly as he had appeared. Madame Du Bois turned to Aria. Her severe expression softened as she took in Aria's pale, shaken face. She placed a hand, surprisingly strong and warm, on Aria's shoulder. "Child," she said, her voice now a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Do you know why I chose you? It was not for your face alone. It was for the story your eyes tell. The story of a soul that has fought for its own light. That is the most profound beauty there is." She gestured to the final garment, which was being carefully unwrapped by two assistants. It was a gown of impossible, architectural beauty, crafted from layers of shimmering, pearlescent organza. "That is not a dress," Madame Du Bois said, her gaze intense. "It is a victory. And tonight, You will wear it for all the world to see." The fear in Aria's heart didn't vanish, but it was joined by something else, the fierce, indomitable spirit of the woman before her. She was not just a model in a show, she was a soldier in a war for the soul, and she had just been handed her armor by its greatest general. The show began. The music swelled, a haunting, beautiful melody. One by one, the models walked. Finally, it was her turn. Dressed in the magnificent gown, she stood at the head of the runway, hidden by the dark velvet curtain. On the other side was the blinding light, the sea of faces, the culmination of her entire life. She could feel Lily's hands squeezing her own, a final, grounding touch. "Ready?" the stage manager whispered. Aria took one last, deep breath. She was no longer a boy in an attic or a ghost in an office. She was Aria. And this was her garden. The velvet curtain parted, and a wall of light and sound hit her. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, the world dissolved into a blinding white glare, the haunting music and the percussive beat of 100 camera shutters merging into a single, overwhelming roar. Her mind went blank. The carefully practiced instructions on posture and pace evaporated. She was just a girl in a beautiful dress, paralyzed at the precipice of her entire life. In that split second of panic, her father's voice, the voice of Marcus Thorne, echoed in her mind. "Cease this embarrassment. Failure and scandal." This was it. This was the moment she would falter, the moment his prophecy would be fulfilled in front of the entire world. Then another voice, her mother's, rose from a deeper place. "Never let anyone convince you that your softness is a weakness. It is your great strength." And Madame Du Bois's words, "That is not a dress. It is a victory." Something shifted. The blinding light was no longer an assault, it was a spotlight she had earned. The roar of the cameras was not a threat, it was an ovation waiting to happen. She wasn't walking into an ambush. She was walking into her own coronation. She took the first step. The gown, a masterpiece of engineering and art, moved with her like a living thing, its pearlescent layers catching the light, shifting from ivory to pale rose to the softest blue. She didn't just walk, she glided, her every movement imbued with the weight of her journey. She wasn't thinking about her feet or her posture. She was thinking about the little boy arranging rose petals, about the dusty attic, about the cold loneliness of the corner office, about the first time she saw Aria in the mirror. She poured all of it, the pain, the fear, the defiance, the joy into her stride. Her gaze was not vacant or haughty, as was the trend. It was direct, serene, and profoundly present. She looked out at the sea of shadowed faces, not as judges, but as witnesses. And in her eyes, they saw it all. The camera lenses, hungry for a story, found the epic they had been waiting for. They saw a beauty that was more than skin deep, it was soul deep. Halfway down the runway, she saw him. He was in the front row, a dark, immovable shape in a sea of fashion's elite. Arthur Worthington Sr. He was not looking at her with the rage she had expected. His face was a mask of cold, stunned disbelief. He was watching a ghost. He was watching his wife. Aria's mother had never walked a runway, but the graceful tilt of her head, the quiet strength in her posture, the gentle, sad wisdom in her eyes, it was all there, resurrected in the child he had tried so hard to break. Aria saw the shock on his face, the flicker of something that looked like pained recognition. She did not falter. She met his gaze for a single, fleeting moment. There was no anger in her eyes, no plea for acceptance. There was only a calm, undeniable statement of fact. "I am here. This is who I am." She reached the end of the runway and turned, the gown flaring around her like the petals of a magnificent, blooming flower. As she walked back, the applause began. It started with a few people, then grew, swelling into a wave of thunderous, heartfelt ovation that shook the entire hall. It was more than just appreciation for a beautiful dress. It was an acknowledgement of a transcendent moment. They knew, without knowing, that they had just witnessed something more than a fashion show. They had witnessed a soul claiming its victory. When she stepped behind the curtain, her legs were trembling, her body flooded with an adrenaline so potent it felt like electricity. Lily was there, her face a mess of tears and mascara, and threw her arms around her. "You did it," Lily sobbed, her voice thick with awe. "Oh, Aria, you did it." Behind them, Madame Dubois stood, a rare, brilliant smile on her face. The applause was still roaring. The walk was over, but the world had irrevocably, undeniably changed. The moment Aria stepped behind the curtain, the thunderous applause became a muffled, distant roar, like the sea heard from inside a seashell. The adrenaline that had carried her down the runway gave way, and her legs threatened to buckle. It was Lily's arms, strong and sure, that held her up. They clung to each other, a tiny island of tearful, triumphant silence in the swirling vortex of backstage chaos. Models, dressers, and technicians rushed past them, but many paused, their expressions of cool professionalism replaced by something new, awe. A few of the other models, girls who had barely glanced at her before, met her eye and gave small, respectful nods. She was no longer an outsider. She had earned her place. Madame Dubois approached, her movements precise and deliberate amidst the frenzy. She didn't gush or congratulate. She simply took Aria's face in her hands, her thumbs gently brushing away the tears that were now freely flowing. "Tonight," she said, her voice clear and resonant, "you did not wear a dress. You wore your soul." And the world was wise enough to stand and applaud. It was the highest praise, the ultimate benediction from the high priestess of the art form. Meanwhile, in the front row, Arthur Worthington Sr. remained seated for a long moment after the lights came up. The applause, the standing ovation, the cries of bravo washed over him, but he didn't hear them. He saw only the ghost of his wife, resurrected in the child he had tried to disown. It was Eleanor's grace, her quiet strength, her infuriating, unyielding softness that he had just witnessed, embodied in a form he could not comprehend. He had come to Milan to witness the end of a rebellion, to see his power confirmed. Instead, he had been forced to witness a coronation. He stood, his movements stiff, his face an unreadable mask of stone, and walked out. He didn't speak to anyone. He ignored the reporters shouting his name, the sycophants who tried to catch his eye. He was a man whose carefully constructed world had just been shattered by a memory and a victory he could not control. For the first time in decades, Arthur Worthington had lost, and he had lost publicly. The foundation of his absolute authority had been cracked. By the time Aria and Lily got back to their small hotel room, the internet had exploded. Every major news outlet, fashion journal, and celebrity gossip site was leading with the same story. Photos and videos of the walk were everywhere. #Aria Dubois was the #1 trending topic worldwide. The world was insatiable. They demanded to know everything about the mysterious, soulful model who had stolen the show and captured the heart of the industry. The roar had become a global phenomenon. Aria sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone, not with ego, but with a sense of profound, dizzying disbelief. She saw her own face, her own story, reflected back at her a million times over. "He lost, Lily," she whispered, looking up at her friend, her eyes wide with the enormity of it all. "Tonight, in front of everyone, he actually lost." "No, darling," Lily said, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "You won." And in the quiet of the small room, with the city of Milan humming below and the entire world clamoring for her, Aria finally allowed herself to believe it. The morning after was a deluge. Their small hotel room, which had been a quiet sanctuary, became the global epicenter of the fashion world. Aria's phone, which she'd had to put on silent, was a solid, vibrating block of metal, its screen a constant, strobing cascade of notifications. The hotel's front desk called, their voice a mixture of awe and panic, to inform them that the lobby was filled with flower arrangements so numerous they constituted a fire hazard. Emails flooded Lily's laptop, each one from a more powerful sender than the last. Every major modeling agency in the world, including the ones that had sent them curt, dismissive rejections, was now practically begging for a meeting. Corinne from Elysian Models sent a message that was a masterclass in groveling, speaking of our immediate and profound belief in your unique talent and a misunderstanding at a junior level. Aria and Lily sat amidst the chaos, a tray of untouched croissants between them, looking at each other with wide, disbelieving eyes. The wall their father had built hadn't just been breached, it had been turned into a tourist attraction, and everyone wanted a piece of the rubble. So Lily said, taking a sip of coffee, her voice laced with irony. "What's the plan? Do we call back the woman who told us you weren't the right fit?" Aria looked at the email from Corinne. A month ago, it would have been the validation she craved. Now, it just felt hollow. Vengeance was a stone, and she had promised herself, promised her mother, that she would be a garden. "No," she said softly. "We don't call anyone back. Not yet." She felt a strange, quiet calm settling over her. The frantic, desperate need for approval was gone, replaced by a sense of profound responsibility. The world wasn't just looking at a new model, they were looking at her, at Aria, at a story that was resonating far beyond the runway. "All this time," she said, gesturing to the buzzing phone, "we were trying to get their attention. Now that we have it, we have to decide what we want to say." Her victory had given her more than a career, it had given her a platform. She thought of the countless messages she had received, the stories from young people struggling with their identity, their parents, their place in the world. Her walk was not just her own. As they talked, the television droned on in the background, tuned to a global news channel. A headline crawled across the bottom of the screen. "Starkweather Holdings continues hostile advance on Worthington Industries. Share prices tumble." Lily glanced at it. "Looks like your dad has bigger problems than your choice of career right now." Aria looked at the screen. The name Worthington Industries felt like a report from a foreign country she had once visited long ago. She felt a strange detachment, a complete absence of the schadenfreude she might have expected. That world of hostile takeovers and tumbling stock prices was her father's language, his battlefield. It had nothing to do with her. She turned back to Lily, her mind clear. "I don't want to sign with any of them," she said, a new resolve in her voice. "Not like this. I don't want to be just another model on their board. We did this ourselves, you and I. We can build something new. An agency, a platform, something that champions the kind of beauty they've always ignored." It was an audacious, almost impossible idea. But as Lily looked at the quiet fire in Aria's eyes, she knew it was exactly what they were going to do. They had been a kingdom of two, fighting a lonely war against an empire. Now it was time to open the gates and invite others in. While Aria and Lily were sketching the blueprints for a new kind of kingdom, the empire they had rebelled against was beginning to crumble. The news ticker Aria had seen was just the tip of the iceberg. Arthur Worthington Sr.'s defeat in Milan was more than a personal humiliation. It was a sign of weakness, and in the predatory world of high finance, weakness is blood in the water. For years, his rival, a ruthless corporate raider named Marcus Starkweather, had been circling Worthington Industries, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. Arthur Sr., distracted and emotionally volatile from his personal war against his own child, had taken his eye off the ball. He had become arrogant, believing his power to be absolute and unassailable. While he was focused on pulling strings to block a model from a runway show, Starkweather was orchestrating a complex and devastating hostile takeover bid, quietly buying up shares and swaying board members. The public spectacle in Milan was the final catalyst. Stories began to leak to the financial press, not just about the takeover, but about the reason for Arthur's distraction. Anonymous sources spoke of his obsession, his misuse of corporate influence to settle a family matter, his increasingly erratic behavior. His image as an untouchable titan of industry began to tarnish, replaced by that of a petty, vindictive old man. Shareholders grew nervous. The stock price, once a pillar of stability, began a catastrophic slide. Arthur Sr. was trapped in a war on two fronts. One was against the ghost of his wife and the child he didn't understand, a battle he had already lost. The other was against a shark who smelled his blood, a battle he was about to lose. He threw himself into the fight with Starkweather with the last of his ferocious energy, but it was too little, too late. His focus was fractured, his reputation damaged. He was hemorrhaging support from the inside, his board members and investors more concerned with saving their own fortunes than with loyalty to a failing king. The company that had been his life's work, the monument of cold, hard power he had built in his wife's absence, was being dismantled, piece by piece. He would spend his days in brutal, soul-crushing meetings, only to return to his silent, cavernous penthouse at night, haunted by the image of Aria on the runway. He saw Eleanor in every shadow. The softness he had spent a lifetime trying to expunge from his son, the very quality he had despised, was the same quality that had captivated the world and, in some indirect but undeniable way, had led to his downfall. Meanwhile, Aria was moving in the opposite direction. She and Lily returned from Milan not to a quiet studio, but to a temporary office, fielding calls from lawyers and business advisors. They were formalizing their vision. They would create Atelier Aria, a hybrid agency and creative platform dedicated to fostering beauty with a story. They would represent models who, like Aria, didn't fit the conventional mold. They would champion diversity not as a trend, but as a core principle. The news of their venture, when it was announced, was met with enormous excitement. The girl who had been blacklisted was now creating her own list, and everyone wanted to be on it. Aria watched the news of her father's company's crisis with a strange, aching sadness. There was no triumph, no sense of victory. It was like watching a great, ancient tree she had once lived under finally topple over. She had never wanted to destroy her father's empire. She had only ever wanted the freedom to build her own small garden. Now, his kingdom was turning to ashes, and she was left to cultivate her own, wondering if the seeds of forgiveness could ever take root in such scorched earth. The news of Worthington Industries' collapse was a constant, grim headline. Starkweather's takeover was all but complete. The company was being gutted, its assets sold off, its legacy tarnished. Arthur Sr. had been publicly ousted, a king dethroned and exiled from his own kingdom. The financial world had already moved on. Aria, immersed in the whirlwind of launching her new agency, tried to keep it at a distance, but it was impossible. Reporters hounded her, not just about fashion, but about her father, hoping for a vindictive quote, a triumphant "I told you so." She refused all of it, maintaining a quiet, dignified silence on the matter that only fueled the public's fascination with her. One evening, as she and Lily were working late in their bustling new office, a call came through on the main line. The receptionist, sounding flustered, patched it through to Aria's office. "I'm sorry to bother you, Miss Aria," she said, "but there's a gentleman on the line who insists on speaking with you. A Mr. Thorne." The name sent a chill down Aria's spine. Marcus Thorne, the corporate hitman who had delivered her father's ultimatum backstage in Milan. Lily, seeing the look on Aria's face, immediately put the call on speaker. "What do you want?" Aria asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the cold dread she felt. Thorne's voice was different from how she remembered it. The arrogant, menacing edge was gone, replaced by a weary, almost desperate professionalism. "Miss Aria, your father is no longer with the company. I, and a small group of senior executives who remain, are trying to salvage what is left of it. Starkweather's acquisition is not yet finalized. We are attempting to launch a last-ditch counteroffer to rebrand to save the company from being completely dismantled." "I fail to see what this has to do with me," Aria said, her tone icy. There was a pause. "The Worthington brand is toxic," Thorne said, the admission sounding like it was physically painful for him to make. "It's associated with your father's public difficulties, with his failure. We have done market analysis. Polling. The only positive association the public currently has with the name Worthington is you." Aria and Lily stared at each other, stunned into silence. "Our branding team," Thorne continued, the desperation now clear in his voice, "has put forward a proposal. A new campaign. A new face for the company. A story of generational change, of a new, more modern vision. They want you to be the face of Worthington Industries." The irony was so profound, so staggering, it was almost comical. The company that had been the instrument of her oppression, whose resources had been marshaled to destroy her, was now on its knees, begging her to be its savior. "You want to hire me," Aria said, the words tasting strange in her mouth. The embarrassment. The scandal. Thorne was silent for a moment. "Yes," he said finally. "We do. We know what your father did. We know the history. But there are thousands of employees whose jobs are on the line. People who had nothing to do with his personal vendetta. The company is more than just one man. We are prepared to offer your new agency a contract that would be substantial, enough to secure its future for the next decade." He was offering her everything. Financial security for her own burgeoning empire and the ultimate poetic justice. The chance to stand victorious on the ashes of her father's reign. "I'll think about it," Aria said, and hung up the phone. She looked at Lily, whose expression was a whirlwind of shock, fury, and disbelief. "Can you believe the audacity?" Lily fumed. "After everything he did? They want to use you to clean up his mess." "Yes," Aria said quietly, her mind already spinning, looking past the irony, past the vengeance. "They do." She wasn't thinking about her father, or even about the money. She was thinking about her mother's words. "Never let anyone convince you that your softness is a weakness. It is your great strength." Strength wasn't about destruction or revenge. It was about creation. It was about seeing beauty where others saw only ruin. And in this ruin, she saw the faintest, most impossible glimmer of an opportunity, not for revenge, but for reconciliation. For 2 days, the offer hung in the air, a paradox of poison and opportunity. Lily was vehemently against it. "It's a trap, Aria," she argued, pacing the office. "They'll use your image, save the company, and then find a way to push you out. It's his world, his rules. You'd be walking back into the lion's den." Aria understood the logic. Every rational instinct told her to reject the offer, to let the crumbling empire fall and focus on building her own. But something deeper, a quiet, insistent voice that sounded a lot like her mother's, urged her to look beyond the rational. Vengeance would be easy. It would be a sharp, satisfying victory that would ultimately leave her feeling empty. Forgiveness, reconciliation, that was the harder path, the one that required a strength her father had never possessed. She thought of the thousands of employees Thorne had mentioned, ordinary people whose lives were tied to the company's fate. She thought of the Worthington Foundation, her father's one genuinely philanthropic endeavor, which funded arts and education programs and would be dissolved if the company collapsed. Her mother had helped establish that foundation. Tearing everything down felt like destroying the last few bricks her mother had laid. On the 3rd day, she made her decision. She called Marcus Thorne back. "I will consider your offer," she said, her voice calm and measured, "but I have terms. They are not negotiable." Aria, with Lily and a team of shrewd lawyers at her side, met with Thorne and the remnants of the Worthington board. The meeting took place not in their corporate tower, but in her agency's office, her territory. She walked into the conference room not as a model, but as a CEO. She was poised, confident, wearing a simple, elegant dress that was the antithesis of a corporate suit. She was Aria, and she was in control. "My first term is this," she began, her voice resonating in the quiet room. "Atelier Aria will be given complete creative control over the rebranding campaign. The message will not be one of corporate legacy, but of personal evolution and acceptance. It will be a campaign about the courage to embrace change." Thorne and the board members nodded, looking relieved. This was expected. "Second," she continued, "the Worthington Foundation will be restructured. Its mission will be expanded to include significant funding for LGBTQ+ youth shelters, arts programs, and mental health services. Its board will be reconstituted to include leaders from those communities. My mother's legacy of compassion will be its guiding principle." A few of the older board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Thorne, seeing the brilliance of the public relations move, nodded again. "Acceptable." "Third," Aria said, her gaze steady, unwavering. "I will not be just the face of the company. I will be given a voting seat on the new board of directors. If I am to save this company, I will have a voice in its future." This was the bombshell. A gasp went through the room. A model, a transgender model, on the board of one of the oldest, most conservative corporations in the country? It was unthinkable. That's highly irregular, one of the executives stammered. The situation is highly irregular, Lily countered, her voice like ice. Take it or leave it. Thorne was silent for a full minute, calculating the odds, weighing the cost of this unprecedented demand against the certainty of utter ruin. He saw the resolve in Aria's eyes. This wasn't a negotiation tactic, it was a line in the sand. We agree, he said finally, the words tasting like surrender. Aria took a deep breath. There is one final term, she said, her voice softening slightly. It is a personal one. The contract will contain a clause. Arthur Worthington Sr. will retain his full pension and benefits. And, she paused, the company will ensure he has access to the best possible care for his health and well-being. She didn't say mental health, but the implication was clear. It was an act of grace, a daughter's final, quiet duty to a father who had given her nothing but pain. It was the ultimate expression of her strength. The board stared at her, utterly disarmed. They had come expecting a vengeful victor. Instead, they found a compassionate, visionary leader. Of course, Thorne said, humbled. The deal was struck. Aria had not walked back into the lion's den. She had walked in and tamed the lion, rewriting the rules of the entire jungle. The Worthington Reimagined campaign was a masterpiece of corporate and personal storytelling. Under Aria's complete creative control, it was nothing like the company's previous, sterile advertisements that featured images of oil rigs and skyscrapers. The campaign was simply Aria. The lead photograph, shot by Lily, was breathtaking in its simplicity and power. It featured Aria, not in a couture gown, but in a simple, elegant silk blouse. Her expression was serene, her gaze direct, looking straight into the camera, into the eyes of the world. The background was a soft, out-of-focus garden. She looked both strong and gentle, a perfect embodiment of the company's new, forward-looking ethos. The tagline was a single, resonant sentence. The future is not what we build. It's who we become. The campaign was a sensation. It was hailed as a landmark in advertising, a bold, humane statement from a company that had been on the brink of collapse. It was authentic, it was moving, and it was undeniably Aria. The public responded with overwhelming support. The stock price stabilized and then began to climb. The counteroffer against Starkweather, backed by this new wave of public goodwill and shareholder confidence, was successful. The company, battered and bruised, had survived. Aria, the child its former king had tried to erase, had become its savior. Arthur Worthington Sr. watched all of this from the silent, self-imposed exile of his penthouse. He had been stripped of his power, his title, his life's work. The television and internet were filled with the face of his child, a face that was a constant, painful reminder of his wife and his own catastrophic failure. His initial reaction was a bitter, impotent rage. She had taken everything from him. But as the weeks turned into months, the rage began to curdle, leaving a hollow, aching void in its place. He was alone, truly and completely alone for the first time in his life, with nothing but his memories and regrets. The silence of the vast apartment was no longer a sign of his power, but of his irrelevance. One day, a package arrived. It was from the new board of the Worthington Foundation. Inside was a formal invitation to the dedication of a new wing of the city's main art museum, funded by the foundation in his wife's name, the Eleanor Worthington Pavilion for Emerging Artists. Tucked inside was a small, handwritten note on simple, elegant stationery. I know how much this would have meant to her. It was signed simply Aria. He held the note in his trembling hand. It was an olive branch, an act of grace he had neither earned nor deserved. He looked at the main campaign photograph, which he had clipped from a magazine and left on his desk, an object of both fascination and torture. He looked at her eyes, his wife's eyes, and for the first time, he did not see a defiant stranger. He saw a strength he had mistaken for weakness, a resilience he had tried to crush, and a grace that was now being extended to him. He saw the daughter of the woman he had loved, and for the first time, a crack appeared in the stone fortress around his heart. He thought of Eleanor's words in the garden, a conversation he had dismissed and long tried to forget. His soul is not a fortress to be built. It's a garden. He had spent a lifetime building a fortress, and now he was its sole prisoner, while his child, the one he had cast out, was tending a garden for the entire world to see. Slowly, painfully, he picked up a pen. He was a man who had dictated contracts that moved billions of dollars, but the single sentence he wrote on his personal stationery was the most difficult and most important of his life. A week later, reply arrived at Aria's office. It was a single, heavy cream-colored card, the kind her father used for his most personal correspondence. The handwriting, once so bold and commanding, was now slightly unsteady, the letters smaller than she remembered. It contained only one sentence. I will be at the dedication. The day of the Eleanor Worthington Pavilion's opening was bright and clear. The event was the talk of the city, a symbol of the Worthington brand's rebirth and a celebration of its new, compassionate vision. Aria was there as a member of the board and as the quiet, undisputed architect of its salvation. She moved through the crowd with a calm, serene grace, accepting compliments and congratulations, but her eyes kept drifting towards the entrance. She found him standing alone in a quiet alcove, away from the main throng, looking at a portrait of Eleanor that hung near the entrance. He looked smaller than she remembered, the imposing power that had once radiated from him replaced by a quiet, weary fragility. The bespoke suit hung on him a little loosely, and his face was etched with lines of grief she had never seen before. He turned as she approached, and for a moment, they simply stood in silence, the space between them filled with the weight of 20 years of pain and misunderstanding. She would have loved this, he said, his voice raspy, gesturing to the beautiful, light-filled gallery. She always believed art was the soul's native language. Yes, Aria replied softly. She did. He finally turned his full attention to her, and his eyes, for the first time, were not filled with anger or confusion, but with a deep, sorrowful clarity. I saw her, he said, his voice barely a whisper. That night in Milan. When you walked, it was like she was there. You have her grace, her strength. He took a shaky breath, the confession of a lifetime finally breaking free. I spent my whole life building fortresses. I thought it was strength. I saw your mother's softness, and then I saw it in you, and it terrified me. Because I couldn't control it. I couldn't protect it. And when she died, his voice broke, and he had to stop. I tried to turn you into a fortress, too. I thought I was protecting you from the world's cruelty. But I was just imprisoning you. I became the cruelty. Tears welled in his eyes, the first she had ever seen him shed. I was blind, he said. I was a fool. I tried to destroy the most beautiful thing I had left. Aria felt her own eyes fill with tears, not of anger, but of a profound, aching catharsis. I never wanted to destroy your kingdom, Dad, she said, the word Dad feeling both strange and right. I only ever wanted to be allowed to tend my own garden. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, at the elegant woman, the compassionate leader, the beautiful, resilient soul standing before him. He saw the daughter he had refused to see. Aria, he said, the name a surrender and an acceptance. My daughter. Your garden, it's magnificent. He reached out, not to grab or command, but with an open, trembling hand. Aria took it. His hand felt old and frail in hers. The war was over. Forgiveness, quiet and profound, settled in the space between them. They stood side by side for a long time, father and daughter, looking at the portrait of the woman they both loved, her painted eyes smiling down on them. Your mother, Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion, she would have been so proud of the woman you've become. And in the heart of the beautiful pavilion named for his wife, surrounded by the art she had cherished, Arthur Worthington finally understood. His child had not been the rose he needed to protect, but the gardener who would, in the end, teach him how to grow again. The fortress had fallen, and in its place, a garden was in bloom.